The prior article in this two-part series was about the strategic nuclear doctrine strategy called Counterforce, which was created out of the evolving theory of fighting a limited nuclear war. The concepts of counterforce, created during the Cold War, were to target the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons and the supporting infrastructure and command and control. The ultimate reason for counterforce was to serve the purpose of saving cities, populations, and economies by either degrading the Soviet Union's ability and capability to attack U.S. cities with their strategic nuclear weapons, or serving as a warning not to. The doctrine of attacking the cities and economy of the Soviet Union was called Countervalue, and was the ultimate deterrent and, if necessary, the goal of a general nuclear war. The assets targeted in countervalue strategies were the cities and economy of the Soviet Union. Without these assets, people, and industry, a country could not be a functioning country. It was the ultimate deterrent of a nuclear war, and all other strategies were based on protecting these assets or deterring them from being attacked. Countervalue and counterforce are U.S. terms, but it is agreed that the Soviet Union followed the same basic logic in its targeting doctrines. A nuclear doctrine could also be based entirely on the idea of countervalue targeting. This is known as minimal deterrence, and it's something that President Carter thought about before he officially declared a limited nuclear war capability. Notably, China had a minimal deterrence policy until the late 2010s. It was called minimal deterrence because the number of nuclear weapons was relatively small. A country's only goal in a nuclear war is to destroy a country's cities and economy. Studies by the Nixon, Ford, and Carter administrations had made a determination, during civil defense reviews, that 2,200 nuclear warheads could create up to 120,000 Soviet casualties. To understand the minimum size of 2,200 warheads, consider that at the end of the Cold War, the U.S. and Soviet Union each possessed approximately 25,000 nuclear weapons of all types. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who served in this role in both the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, set a criterion that the minimal deterrence force needed to maintain minimal deterrence was to have enough nuclear weapons to destroy 50% of Soviet industry and 25% of its population. It was determined that the number of warheads needed to accomplish this was 200 to 400 nuclear warheads with a minimal yield of 1 megaton apiece, which is about 67 times the power of the nuclear weapon dropped on Hiroshima in 1945. The goal of this minimal deterrence criterion was the ability to kill at least 62,500 Soviet citizens. President Carter, in Presidential Directive 59 in 1980, did require that any nuclear doctrine of the U.S. maintain a strategic reserve force that would always be available to maintain the minimal level of deterrence. The United States nuclear submarine fleet, with its SLBM warheads, was considered the primary means to provide this reserve force, as seen by President Carter, or the minimal deterrence envisioned by Secretary McNamara. People thought the SLBM was the best weapon for countervalue or minimal deterrence, because it wasn't very accurate at hitting nuclear weapon sites before the Trident II D5 missile came out in 1990, and U.S. submarines at sea were almost impossible for the Soviets to find, so they couldn't attack them. The strategy with a countervalue or minimal deterrence strategy was that if a nuclear attack was to occur, the country being attacked would automatically go right to the ultimate target and launch its full nuclear arsenal at the opposing cities. There would be no escalation path. It would immediately go right to the top of the ultimate target of the country's population and industry. This would also mean that the preferred weapons to use would be submarine SLBMs or strategic bombers that would allow time to evaluate the attack coming into the country. If a minimal deterrence strategy was adopted based only on ICBMs, a launch-on-warning doctrine would be assumed because a counterforce attack could leave a country hostage. The deterrent, if ICBMs were used, is the publicly known position of launching on warning. The issue with minimal deterrence or countervalue-only nuclear doctrine for the United States was the fact that it was in military alliances, mainly NATO, Japan, and South Korea. The U.S., early on in its strategic doctrine of massive retaliation, extended its nuclear umbrella to allied countries. As the strategic doctrine evolved, the nuclear umbrella was still extended. The United States' commitment to using its nuclear weapons to defend its allies presented a problem. If the U.S. adopted minimal deterrence only, and an attack occurred on an allied nation, would the U.S. decide to launch its countervalue attack against the Soviet Union knowing that the Soviets would respond in kind to the U.S. attack and attack U.S. cities? The allies of the U.S., most notably President Charles de Gaulle, questioned if the U.S. would be willing to sacrifice its cities and people to protect its allies. The basic question from the French president to President John F. Kennedy is, would the U.S. be willing to trade New York to protect Paris? If the U.S. wanted to prevent nuclear proliferation and protect its allies, it could not adopt a countervalue or minimal deterrence-only policy. The U.S. commitments did not completely satisfy the British and the French, who both created their own nuclear arsenals to protect their countries. The U.S. adoption of a minimal deterrence or a countervalue-only doctrine would not have prevented a nuclear arms race, but it would have prevented the U.S. from being involved in one with the Soviet Union. The doctrine of assured destruction, mutual assured destruction, or nuclear equivalency that was adopted during the Cold War starting in the 1960s had an unintended consequence that became adopted in nuclear arms acquisition. Both the U.S. and the Soviet Union maintain nuclear arsenals of relatively the same size to prevent one side or the other from getting an advantage in the assured destruction goal. If the U.S. did not get into an arms race with the Soviets, logic would suggest, but not guarantee, that the Soviets would be de-incentivized to build a large nuclear arsenal as well. Although the Soviets could have created a large nuclear arsenal to threaten or blackmail other countries in the West to submit to them, this would have incentivized nuclear proliferation, creating a more challenging strategic situation for the Soviets. In the end, if any of their threats against the West materialized, it would still result in the ultimate destruction of their society, despite their potentially superior-sized nuclear arsenal. Another factor that worked against the idea of a countervalue attack is the moral implication of it, which is comical to say when discussing nuclear weapons that can destroy lives so easily. The moral implication is that the U.S. was in an ideological battle with the Soviet Union, and the U.S. and the West held the moral high ground when it came to human rights and freedom. The U.S. would be officially committing to a countervalue-only or minimal deterrence strategy if it meant attacking civilian populations with the goal of causing mass destruction. This would be the case even if the Soviet Union only attacked military sites. This argument seems irrelevant after World War II, when cities and civilian populations were intentionally attacked, including with 2 nuclear weapons, as part of a total war doctrine. In the ideological war, these inconvenient facts were ignored or glossed over or explained that the world must not go back to the tragedy of World War II. This moral high ground of the U.S. would have been lost if civilian populations were the first and only target for a strategic nuclear attack. Also, U.S. vested interests sometimes opposed minimal deterrence and countervalue. Those vested interests would mainly be with the institutional elements within the U.S. defense establishment. This doctrine would have elevated the U.S. Navy and its nuclear submarines to the top of the services, as it would be the one most effective in assuring the invulnerability of the U.S. strategic deterrence. The ICBM would be unnecessary, and the strategic bomber would be as well, though the mobile nature of the bomber would mean it could be justified in this doctrine. Either way, the U.S. Air Force could find itself without a significant role in nuclear strategy, which is hard for it to give away when it was at one point the only service with a nuclear roll-through. First, its bombers, and later its missiles that were both available prior to the advent of the SLBM in 1961. The defense industry would have also lobbied not to give up the ICBM and strategic bombers, though it would not argue against the SLBM. The defense industry and its influence in Washington would lobby and use its influence for the creation and maintenance of the U.S. strategic triad. The adoption of only minimal deterrence or countervalue would most likely have prevented a nuclear arms race. It would have, however, meant that the only nuclear strategy in place would have been an intentional targeting of civilians on both sides. Both the Soviet Union and the U.S. would have adopted strategies that by necessity would be public, that destroying each other's civilians would be the adopted policy. Even in a non-democratic Soviet Union, it would create a morale problem, which would have impacted embracing the requested sacrifices of communist doctrine, and most definitely would create nuclear protests in the West, like what was seen in the 1970s and 1980s. No matter the government, civilians make the country possible. Hence, they were the ultimate nuclear target, and their cooperation was essential to state function. This problem is one that civil defense and anti-ballistic missiles of the time could not fix, and is ultimately what incentivized other nuclear doctrines such as counterforce and countervailing. A metaphor would be a dog chasing its tail.